Hello and a very warm welcome to everyone joining this webinar today on support for siblings of children who have Fragile X. My name is Liz Jewell and I work as the Family Support Counsellor for Fragile X Association Australia. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land on which we are standing and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Fragile X Association is looking forward to some feedback on our online support programme, including the webinar programme series and online peer support Zoom groups, as well as the Fragile X Association Facebook discussion group. The University of Melbourne is facilitating interviews with people who have involvement in any of these programmes to provide feedback anonymously to help us improve and change the format to better support the Fragile X community. The interviews will be conducted by phone or Zoom with a researcher from the university, and they'll last around 30 minutes. An invitation to participate in this study will be sent to everyone who has registered for tonight's webinar and also promoted via the Fragile X Association website and social media channels. We really welcome your feedback and hope that you'll take part. Kate Strohm is the founder and CEO of Siblings Australia. She has developed a national and international reputation for her work with families, practitioners, research and advocacy over a period of 23 years. Kate brings both personal and professional experience to her work. Her book, Siblings, Brothers and Sisters of Children with Disability, revised edition, Wakefield Press 2014, has been widely published. Siblings Australia is a service committed to improving the support available for siblings of children and adults with chronic conditions, including disability, chronic illness, and mental health issues. Kate will talk a little more about this at the end of the webinar. Without further ado, I would like to hand over the reins to Kate.
Hi everyone, it's lovely to see so much interest in sibling support. So many people have registered for this, which I guess gives me a strong feeling that your children will do okay because you're at least aware and thinking about what their needs might be. And yes, as Liz said, I've been working in this area for quite a number of years after a range of different careers before this, ranging from hospital scientist to health educator, counsellor, journalist, and then set up Siblings Australia after seeing a similar program in the US. And also started writing my book about the same time. And it's interesting that one of the early people that I interviewed for that book was a sister of someone with Fragile X, and it was really wonderful to have her input into that. So I've always been very aware of Fragile X from that particular time in many ways. And I guess the main thing first up that I want to say, and I guess, sorry, what I meant to say going on from that experience is that I bring a number of hats because I have personal experience. My older sister, who passed away about 8 years ago, had cerebral palsy. But since working in Siblings Australia, I've had contact with parents and professionals around Australia and overseas. And so I wear a number of hats. I bring a number of perspectives to the presentation tonight. And as I was started to say, one of the big things to remember is that there's no one sibling experience. It'll change from year to year even, but certainly over a lifetime. And there's a huge variety of experience. Some children manage really well, others really can face a number of challenges and have difficulty managing those challenges. Even within the one family, you can find that there can be differences in responses. And we have to remember that each child within a family might have had a very different experience. An older child, an older sibling of the child with Fragile X might have a very different experience than a younger child. And so their responses might be quite different as well. If we could just move to the first slide, thanks. So the key points that I want to talk about tonight really are that siblings are important for two main reasons. They're important for their own well-being, for their own emotional health, physical health. Certainly, as I said, they can face some challenges, which we need to remember that they're often children who are managing those challenges. As adults, we might say, well, it's obvious, or this, they didn't cause it or whatever. But to a young child, sometimes those experiences can be quite challenging, and their feelings and their responses to those. So we need to remember that they're children. And so it's important to give them support for their own well-being. But also, if we think about who's going to have the longest relationship with that child and then adult with Fragile X, it's going to be siblings. They're going to be there long after special educators, physios, whoever, even parents. And so we really need to think about how we can nurture that relationship from a young age. It's a key lifetime relationship, regardless of any caregiving role whatsoever. It's that relationship that is the important thing. And if we can nurture that relationship from a young age, then it's more likely that they're going to contribute to the well-being, social inclusion and safety of that child and then adult with Fragile X. As I mentioned, siblings can face complex challenges over a lifetime, and it's relatively easy to give them the support they need. The sorts of things I'm going to talk about tonight are very simple things that you can do, or even simply say to a sibling to help them feel that they're being listened to and understood. And so sibling support really leads to benefits for the whole family. If a sibling can be supported, they're much more likely to have greater well-being themselves and not be causing you stress in that sense. They're likely to contribute to the child with disability, and all round a family can benefit from sibling support. Next slide, please. Now, I am going to focus on the difficulties tonight because they're the sorts of things that I guess we need to think about in terms of supporting siblings. But before we get too far, I do want to stress that there are opportunities for siblings. If they're supported, they're likely to have a better understanding of differences and diversity, more compassion, empathy. They can experience real unconditional love both ways, and they often have greater maturity. Now, sometimes that can go too far, and I'm sure you've all seen siblings who've in many ways taken on that adult role way too early. So it can be a problem, but if the child is supported and that responsibility is kept in check, then it can be a really positive thing. And they can also develop a lot of knowledge and skills to maybe take into a career if that's what they want to do. And so, again, there are those opportunities. But sadly, siblings are overlooked. And there's a number of reasons for that. One is they're not good self-advocates. It's very hard for siblings to raise their concerns, and I'll talk later about how it might show up in their behaviour. And parents are stretched. It's hard enough to give time to each child when they don't have a disability. But in this case, where you've got a child with extra needs, then it is hard meeting the needs of all of your children. But also they're easily overlooked in the community. Sadly, organisations don't recognise siblings, even those organisations that support children with disability, which is so short-sighted because, again, if we nurture that relationship from a young age, it's going to have benefits not only for the child with disability, but for the whole family. So the other thing is that there is a range of symptoms of people who have Fragile X. Some may be impacted more than others. And so the experience of siblings might be quite different from one family to another. But I think all of the things that I'm going to be talking about are relevant to whatever the situation is. Siblings need similar things. So just to reflect a bit yourselves, just before I start to talk about some of the challenges for siblings, maybe think about your own children who are siblings and think to yourself, you might even want to jot down a couple of thoughts, but what do you see as some of the challenges for them in your daily life? What sorts of things do you see as maybe being difficult for your children who are siblings? And how might that show up in behaviour? What do you sometimes see in terms of their behaviour that might indicate a reaction to some of those stresses that they might be feeling? So just think about that. And the things that I'm going to talk about not all siblings will experience these things. Certainly some will to a larger extent, some maybe to a much smaller extent, and it might change. The issues for a 5-year-old might be different to a 15-year-old, to a 35-year-old. Next slide, please. So what are some of the challenges for siblings? And certainly one of the things that a lot of adult siblings talk about was the confusion that they felt as children. They didn't understand what was going on around them, and they didn't understand why certain things happened the way they did. They didn't have good information about the impact of the disability on their brother or sister. So there was a lot of confusion and identity issues. And I think often children in this situation will feel that they're not as important, and also how they develop their identity. Or are they always seen as Susie's sister or Harry's brother? But certainly, and especially if they get the message from other people that, well, you're lucky that you don't have Fragile X, or you need to be a good girl because mummy and daddy have a lot to deal with, or whatever. So, they can learn that they can start to feel that they're not as important. Certainly isolation. Often they don't feel that they have anyone they can talk to who understands. Their friends don't understand. They don't maybe want to raise things within their family because they see that you're stressed maybe already. And they can have real difficulty expressing some of those big feelings. And feelings like grief and guilt and anger and fear are big feelings for little kids. And I think grief is something that children often don't understand, and especially in this situation where they might feel sad for what their brother or sister is going through. They might see the challenges for their brother or sister and feel sadness about that. They might feel sad for you as parents because they understand that this is stressful for you. But they might also feel grief for themselves, wishing that they had a brother or sister like their friend Johnny has. So grief, and it can be a complex thing because they don't often understand what that's about. And then guilt sometimes about the fact that they can do things that their brother or sister can't, but also maybe some of those feelings that they have, which, all brothers and sisters love and hate each other from time to time. But I think it can be quite difficult for a child who has a brother or sister with Fragile X to express some of those frustrations or those sorts of things that are very normal for brothers and sisters to feel. So sometimes it's really hard for them to express these feelings. And again, they often don't have anyone that they feel comfortable about expressing the feelings. And often if they do, they might, again, they might be shut down by well-meaning people who might then give them the message again that they shouldn't be expressing these feelings. They shouldn't complain. They're the lucky one, and all of those sorts of things. And there can be shame about some of those feelings. There might be embarrassment if the child with Fragile X behaves in ways that are uncomfortable in public. And we all feel judged by others when we're out in public with our families. And it's a very normal experience for children, even where there's no disability. I mean, most kids feel embarrassed by their families from time to time, but we want to be like everybody else. And that shame can then sometimes lead to low self-esteem. And also that sense of maybe feeling resentful because something gets cancelled again and it doesn't seem fair. And so again, that shame for having feelings that, it's very hard when you might feel very sorry for somebody and what they're going through, but to then feel anger. And it can be very stressful for children to, I guess, understand and manage those different feelings. And there's also often extra responsibility, and sometimes that practical thing where they're asked to look after or look out for or do certain extra things within a family. And there might be a lot of family stress as well that has an impact. Now, extra responsibility, we don't want to take away all responsibility from children because it can be a really positive thing. But I'll talk later about how we make sure that that's kept in balance. And then that pressure to achieve, which I've already sort of alluded to, that sense of that they don't want to make waves, they don't want to add to maybe the stress that you already have, and maybe the pressure to achieve, sometimes to make up for the limitations of the child with Fragile X, or maybe to be noticed, to try and get attention when they feel that maybe they miss out on that attention again, that the other child is more important. And then others' reactions can be a big issue too, or children who might have people staring or making comments, and you know what it's like as a parent. Sometimes you want to educate people, sometimes you might want to tell them to get nicked, and sometimes you just want to ignore people. And I think children can benefit from having a sense of what they might say if somebody says to them anything about their brother or sister. And there can also be worry about the future as they get older, and what might happen if something happens to mum or dad or both, and what role they might play. And so again, as they move into those teen years, it's important to include them in discussions around that. And the other thing that I haven't got on there, but it is very much what I was talking about earlier, that relationship. And sometimes the challenge is there, depending on the impact of the disability. Sometimes it's hard to communicate with their brother or sister, or maybe they have behaviours that push the sibling away, or whatever it might be. And so that relationship needs extra support. And I'll come back to that later. Okay, next slide. So I asked you to reflect earlier on what some of the challenges might be, but also to reflect on what some of those signs of stress might be. Often children won't tell you how they're feeling, but it might show up in their behaviour. So a young child might withdraw or maybe regress. You know, if they're very young, they might need to start wearing nappies again, or they might be very clingy. Some children might act up for attention or to release some tension that they might have. On the other hand, you might have a child who becomes the good child, a people pleaser. And it's very easy for parents to celebrate that and think, you know, well, oh, great, my child's a good child. But if that child is over people pleasing and over being a good child, then they're just as vulnerable as a child who's acting up all the time. They may be hiding some feelings. Now, they may not, and we'll talk about ways of addressing that in a little while, but that perfectionism, overachieving, and that can lead to a lot of physical health problems as well as emotional ones if that's ongoing, and can lead to longer term mental health issues if they're not supported. Now, all kids have tummy aches and sleep problems, but sometimes they're a sign of stress or anxiety. And so again, you know, it's about checking out if there are other physical issues, but just wondering whether this child needs a little bit of extra support to help them manage some of the stresses that they might be feeling. And whether they get on well at school is another sign. I think that on the positive side of that, if a child is managing well at school, has friends, then they're probably managing pretty well. But if a child doesn't want to go to school, or maybe doesn't enjoy school, or doesn't seem to have friends, then it may be that that's a sign of stress to be mindful of. And of course, we can't blame everything that a child goes through on the disability. You know, the disability is only one part of how a family functions, and how a sibling responds will depend a lot on how the people around them respond and how you communicate as a family. It'll depend on the characteristics of the sibling, the impact of the disability, how those siblings interact, how many children are in the family, what your social networks are like. A range of things will impact on how a child will respond to being a sibling. Next slide, please. So these are just a couple of comments from siblings, one reflecting on their childhood where they had a lot of extra responsibility. I felt completely isolated. I thought I couldn't share any of that part of my life with my friends. They didn't understand. and I felt alienated from them. Other kids never had the same responsibility. And then discussion amongst my non-disabled siblings, this was a woman in her 40s who had 2 sisters who were able-bodied and a brother and a sister with severe disability. And they reflected that at no stage in our lives had any professional agency or service ever asked if we were okay. How did we feel? Did we need anything? Or never offered us support. Now, if we said to you as parents, well, no, you're not going to be able to have contact with other parents until, 20, 30 years' time, we would think that was a really strange practice. But siblings will very often go through their lives and not have any contact with other siblings. And you know as parents how important that is. You can say things with other parents of children with Fragile X that you wouldn't dream of saying in a normal social context with people who didn't share that experience. It is just so validating, and nobody really understands a parent like another parent, and nobody understands a sibling like another sibling. Next slide, please. So in general terms, and I'm going to go through this in more detail in a minute, but in general, what really siblings need are open communication within their family, information, and I'll expand on these things in a minute. Permission, feeling special, strong connections with you and extended family and friends, to give them a sense of value and positive meanings. And these connections can assist with the relationship with the child with fragile, and outside sources of support, school or community programs. They can learn how to ask for help and maybe how to manage others' reactions and learn some of those skills. Connections with other siblings, as I said, are crucial. And then help with independence and identity and thinking about the future. Next slide, please. So let's just go through these one by one, and I'm going to give you some tips which are all thoughts that, they're not going to be things that you've got to sort of wake up tomorrow and think about all of them, but they're more likely to be things where maybe, a few weeks down the track, something might happen and you might respond in a certain way, and you might be able to think, no, hang on, maybe I'll go back. And the beautiful thing about children is they're very forgiving. So, if maybe, and we all react in less than positive ways as parents, we might walk out the door and slam the door or whatever, but we can always go back to children and say, look, I'm sorry, I was just feeling upset, or I was anxious, or whatever. So just, keeping in mind some of these things, I think will really help you communicate with your children who are siblings. And the first one is giving information and involving them in discussions. But, one little girl thought that her hat had caused her brother to have his first seizure. And because he'd been playing with her hat and then immediately had a seizure. Now, as adults, we say, well, how could she think that way? But to her, he was the hat. He played with the hat. He had a seizure. So it must have been that. And she didn't let him play with her things again. So we need to make sure that children understand the impact of the disability on their brother or sister, and that they didn't cause it. They're not going to catch it. All of those things. And I think it can be really useful too to talk about strengths and weaknesses in terms of the whole family, so that, mum's really good at that, but don't ask her about that. And dad, yes, he can do that, but not so good on that. And little Johnny with, the person who has Fragile X, he needs some extra support here, but, focusing on something that he might enjoy or that he can do, so that everybody is a loved and respected part of the family, but they all need different types of supports. So, one little girl said to her mum, she had a brother with autism, and she said to her mum, well, Sam's got autism and I've got asthma. Mum, what have you got? Which was a very healthy way of thinking about it in terms of the family, and it made it much easier to be able to manage what was going on. And if you feel that you can't give them that information, then maybe involve some of the therapists that are involved with your child with Fragile X and ask them to help the sibling understand a little bit more. There's a lot of books out there that you can read, but therapists should be able to help you with that too. One mum and her little daughter made a scrapbook about the child. She had something called Dravet syndrome, which included epilepsy and intellectual disability. And this little girl took this picture book that talked about the things that her sister could do and that she needed help with. And she took it to her preschool and shared it with the other kids. So not only did it help her understand, but it also helped the other children understand. And encourage them asking you questions. I think sometimes children don't want to ask questions because they're afraid of upsetting you, but it can be really helpful if they feel that at any stage they can ask questions. And if you don't know the answer, you can say, look, I don't know that, but let's ask this person or that person, or I'll ask them for you, whatever that situation might be. Now, listen and walk in their shoes. And again, it's about that understanding what it's like for them. And it's interesting that a lot of adult siblings say that they just wish their parents had acknowledged that it wasn't easy for them sometimes. And so listening, and I remember one of the people I interviewed for my book talked about the fact that she said to her mother one day, I wish I was deaf. And the mother sadly said to her, that's an awful thing to say. Don't ever say that again. Now, on one level, you can understand the parents saying that, but it just would have been helpful if the mother had said in that situation instead, well, yes, I understand that, sweetie. I know she gets all the lollies, doesn't she? And she gets to do this, but I know you don't really want to be deaf. And, do you need some extra mummy time? Or, just trying to understand what it is that she feels that she's missing out on by not being deaf, and to helping address that. I realised that, yes, I've been out to a lot of appointments with your sister this week, but maybe I'll pick you up from school early next week and we'll have a milkshake together. So again, acknowledging the difficulty for them goes such a huge way to siblings actually managing things so much better if they feel that they're being listened to and understood. Now, watch for behaviour. That's pretty obvious from the things that I talked about. That watching for those sorts of behaviours that might indicate stress. And then, addressing what they might be if they're stressed at school, maybe talking to the school about what they might be having to manage at home. That's probably a good idea anyway, to let the school know what's happening in their family, so that if they're a bit tired or they don't get their homework done or whatever, that they can maybe get a little bit of support from the school, a bit of flexibility maybe. Now, the next one is probably, I think, one of the most important ones, and that is related to some of the things I've been talking about so far, but permission to express their thoughts and feelings. And look, siblings need to complain, just like all kids. Just because they live with someone who might be facing bigger challenges doesn't mean that they shouldn't be allowed to just have a whinge sometimes. And I think I can probably show the idea around this by a story where a mother told me once at a workshop many, many years ago how she had a teenage daughter who had an older sister with intellectual disability. And she seemed quite down. And the mother would often ask her, what's up? You don't seem very happy. And this young person would respond and say, no, nothing, as teenagers tend to do. Anyway, she thought, well, I'll take her out for a coffee and see if I can get her to open up. So they went out for a coffee. And again, the mum said, oh, what's up? You don't seem very happy. And this young person again said, no, nothing. And anyway, fortunately, the mum didn't give up. And she took her out again for a coffee, only this time the mother said, it must be difficult sometimes being the sister to Susie, at which point this kid burst into tears and it all came out. Now, what had that mother given that child? Permission to express any of the difficulties that she might be facing. She gave that child the acknowledgement that she understood that it wasn't always easy. Now, what if her being down had nothing to do with the disability? It was totally to do with maybe one of her girlfriends was going out with the boy she liked or whatever. Would it matter? No, it wouldn't matter at all, because you're still giving that young person the knowledge that you understand. And, she might not have wanted to respond at that time either, but it would have given her permission. She would often, adult siblings often talk about feeling like they were a bad kid because they wanted their brother or sister to disappear sometimes. Well, all brothers and sisters wish that. Or that they, felt embarrassed or whatever it might be. But it just helped that child. And obviously she was then able to express some of those thoughts that she'd been bottling up for so long because her mother had acknowledged it. And I think too, sometimes it's helpful to acknowledge your own feelings. I feel sad today because Susie's not going to be able to go to the same school as you. And, that lets them start to understand feelings as well. But you can use it as a way of helping them to manage feelings. Well, yes, look, I'm feeling really sad, but I'll be okay. Why don't we go and see Grandma this afternoon? That always makes us feel better. So that you're letting them know that it's, feelings are not these big scary things that they have to avoid. Now, having said all that though, giving them permission to feel certain ways doesn't mean giving them permission to behave in certain ways. So I understand you're angry, but it doesn't mean that you can bop your brother over the head or that you can call your sister an idiot or whatever the rules are in your house. So they need to know that any feeling is okay, but they need to learn ways of managing those. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a little while. Another story, this time from my own experience, is that my sister was quite strong in spite of her disability, and she would often hit me and I'd hit her back, and my mother would always say, don't do that, she can't help it. Now, to a little 7 or 8 year old, and my sister was older than me and, like I said, quite strong, she could damn well help it. And it made me feel resentful. Now, what could my mother have done that would have helped me manage that situation? Don't do that, she can't help it. What would have really helped me is if my mother had, and she adored me, so it wasn't that she didn't think that I was important too or upset that I was hit. I know she did, but to me it felt like she didn't care that I was hit. But if she had said, I'm sorry your sister hit you, I wish she didn't do that. But, she doesn't understand, and that's her only way of expressing herself. Then I would have understood that. I would have accepted that second part of much better if I'd had that initial acknowledgement of the impact on me. The other thing that might have helped, even though my mother could tell my sister not to hit me over and over and over again, and it wouldn't have made any difference, if she'd said that, it would have made a difference to me. I would have felt like there were similar rules for both of us. So that's a big thing, I think, for siblings, and certainly adult siblings talk about that a lot. They talk about all the emotion stuffing and how they couldn't express their feelings. The other one that I've mentioned already a little bit is spending one-on-one time, and it doesn't have to be a long time, but just it might be in the car, it might be 5 or 10 minutes at the end of the day when other kids are in bed, or it might, when they're very little, it might mean taking them out of school for a short period of time. Now, in terms of responsibility, I said I'd talk about this a little bit more. I think it's really important to value their help, but then to make sure that that's in balance. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it. That really helps when you do that. But no, this is mummy's job now, or no, dad's going to take over now. You can go and play. So they start to learn that there's some balance, that they don't have to take on all of this responsibility, but that they are valued for the help that they do give. And sometimes I know that schools put a lot of responsibility on siblings if there's another child in the class that needs support. And I think it's important to let schools know that, no, you don't want that. That's their life at home. If the whole classroom takes it in turns to provide extra support to a child, then that's fine, but don't single out the sibling. And that's why I think it's really important for schools to understand that. And the key, I guess, in terms of responsibility is asking whether this child is able to meet their own needs. I mean, one young girl talked about the fact that during high school she had to stay home during the holidays and look after her sister because her mum went to work. Now, she missed out on all of those normal things that teens would do, and her friends came back to school and talked about the things they'd done and the movies they'd seen, and she couldn't be involved in that. So it meant that her needs were being compromised. Learning coping skills, and again, in terms of managing those feelings, different people need different things to manage feelings. Some people, if you're stressed, some of you might like to listen to relaxing music. Some might like to punch a pillow. Some might like to write or draw. And so it's about helping children work out the sorts of things that will help them feel better and manage some of those stresses, but also to maybe have some practice around how they might manage other people's reactions. Imagine if somebody says this to you, what could you say? And let them think of things that they could say that they feel good about saying. But certainly helping them to manage those things, teaching mindfulness, or there's a lot of relaxation tapes if they're a bit stressed, and encouraging their own interests and activities. This is really important. And again, it can be difficult with the things that you've got to do in terms of appointments and all of those sorts of things. But even if you can enlist other people to help a sibling get to certain activities, and encouraging contact with other sibs. I don't need to talk about that anymore, but I think that that's really important. And I'll talk about a program that we've got that might help with that down the track. And then as they become older, to think about the future and to have a sense that you've got it under control, that you know what will happen, and that you are planning that if they're older and they want to know that, it's important to include them in those discussions as well. And I think one of the things that I haven't mentioned there again is nurturing that relationship and having therapists help you with that. So the therapists that are working with your child with Fragile X, ask them how they might be able to nurture that relationship. If there are things that they do with the child with Fragile X, are there some that the sibling could be included in? Or do they have thoughts, an OT or a psychologist, do they have thoughts about things they might do at home to have fun together? Now, for some children, that won't need a lot of work, but for others, it might need a little bit more. Next slide, please. So just a little bit on Siblings Australia too. Our mission is acknowledge, connected, resilient, and that means we hope that siblings' needs will be acknowledged, that they then can be connected to sources of support, and through that they become more able to manage the challenges that they might face and to have good mental health. And next slide too, please. And we have a number of programs. We've got a website that you can find a lot of information. We also have a new e-learning program for parents and professionals called SibWise. You can claim that on your NDIS child's plan under parent carer training. And I think that it's really important to have in your child's goals something around siblings, so that the goal for the child with Fragile X might be to improve my relationships with siblings, or improve the capacity of my siblings to manage and to support me, or whatever that might be, but bringing it back to the goals of that child, because again, remembering that this relationship is crucial. I also run one-on-one parent sessions. I'm away for the next 5 weeks, but if you wanted to go into greater depth in terms of your particular situation, then I can certainly do that. And again, they're claimable through the NDIS under that same support item. And just this week, and we were hoping to do it yesterday, but it looks like it's going to be tomorrow, we're launching a training for people to become registered SibWorks providers. And so we're really hoping that parents will encourage organisations that they come in touch with, whether it's hospitals, schools, disability agencies, anyone that you might come into contact with, encourage them to run SibWorks in their organisation, because we have an aim to have as many siblings being able to connect with other siblings as possible. Through that, they become less isolated. They learn so much in terms of coping. You know, if a child who's a sibling has a challenge of in some way, you know, you or I telling them, oh, well, why don't you do this, doesn't mean nearly as much as if another child says to them, oh, when that happens, I do this and that really helps, or whatever it might be. But to really, the value of that sibling group is immeasurable. And often we find that siblings interact more positively with their brother or sister. I originally wrote the program a number of years ago now, probably more than 15 years ago, with a psychologist from Western Australia, and a number of organisations have run it over the years. It's been used overseas a few times, but we had many years where we didn't have any funding and we weren't able to run it ourselves. But the last couple of years, we've done a major review of the program, really updated it, and now very excited to have this registered program, for people to become registered SibWorks providers. So if people are running SibWorks, you know that they've gone through a very extensive training for that.
I do want to sort of mention to people that you are going to be doing another webinar for our community on adult siblings on the 4th of October. So everybody is more than welcome to join again if you'd like to, or let other individuals know that that's happening.
Because that will be focused mainly for adult siblings, won't it? But obviously if people, but yes, so it'll be mainly helping them think about some of their responses and what that means and the roles they might play. So so if you know any adult siblings, then certainly it'd be great to see them then. Yeah,
thank you, Kate.
Thank you all.
Much. Yeah, and just a reminder to everyone that next Tuesday we have another webinar that's on carrier testing for Fragile X with Dr. Alison Archibald from the Victorian Clinical Genetics Services. Dr. Archibald is a certified genetic counsellor and group leader for the reproductive genetic counselling team at VCGS. And she provides genetic counselling regarding Fragile X and associated conditions, and also undertakes research around people's experiences of carrier screening. The webinar will cover the genetics and inheritance of Fragile X and how carrier testing works. Alison will also talk about considerations about timing of testing and reproductive considerations for people who receive a carrier result. And will also be followed by a Q&A session. So look forward to many people signing up for that one also. All right, well, that brings us to the end of this evening. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining. Thank you for your comments and questions, and we really look forward to seeing you again soon.